Okay, we are live. Thank you, Andy. Welcome, everyone. Those of you that are watching us at home, welcome. We are so delighted to have you here. The Lord is giving us rain today for the first time in about 3 weeks, so we are being blessed in so many different ways, but that's one of them. We pray the Lord is blessing you as well today, and we are in Exodus class number 3. We're studying today Exodus 1:15 through 2:10, and this is where we're going to meet Moses for the first time as today. We're going to meet him as a baby, but we're going to meet him today. So if you would, just open your Bibles to that, and if you want to download the notes that everybody has in class, you can click on the link online and you can download the notes. Before we get into today's class, I want to tell you that today's a very special day. Today is one of the 7 great feasts or festivals that God has given us in the Bible. In Leviticus 23, God outlined 7 festivals that the Jews are supposed to follow forever. For whatever reason, the church over time has not gone with many of these. Today is the Festival of Trumpets, and that actually occurs this afternoon at 3:54 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time. So if you are out and about at that time, you might want to be mindful of it. That is the moment of the new moon. So the new moon is completely new, completely at its fullest at 3:54 today. We've talked many times over the years about how the 7 Jewish festivals relate to the 7 major events of our salvation through Christ. The first one in the spring is Passover, which is the death of Christ. Christ died on Passover. The second is the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is conquering sin. Leaven is considered to be sin in Jewish tradition, and that is the day after after Passover, and that is the day that, as we saw in Hebrews 9, that Jesus went up to the Father and laid his blood on the throne in front of the Father, which completed that process. The third one is the Feast of First Fruits, Festival of First Fruits, which occurs on the Sunday after Passover. That happens to be Easter Sunday. That is the day Christ rose from the dead. So that's the third major event in our salvation. The fourth one occurs 7 Sundays later, and we call that Pentecost, and that is the birthday of the church. That is called the Feast of Weeks, by the way, or the Festival of Weeks. So those are the 4 things from Christ's first coming. And the last 3 are in the fall, and they're all this month, the month of Tishrei. And this is the Jewish month of Tishrei, by the way. And they are all about Jesus' second coming. So the first one, presumably, is the rapture. That is the Festival of Trumpets, which is today. I'm not saying the rapture is going to occur today. It might, but I'm not saying it will. But the first one is the Festival of Trumpets, which is today. And that is about Jesus taking his church off the earth to begin the whole 7-year tribulation process. The second one is the Festival of Yom Kippur, which occurs on the 10th day of Tishrei, so that is 9 days from today. And that is about the second coming of Jesus, where he comes back and judges sin in the world. And the third one is 4 days later, and that is called the Festival of Tabernacles. And that looks forward to the millennial kingdom, the 1,000-year reign of Christ on earth. So those are the 3 major events of the second coming of Jesus, and this is the first one of those today. So the Festival of Trumpets, when you read what Leviticus 23 says, it doesn't say much. The Jews kind of scratch their head at the Festival of Trumpets. They don't really understand what it means. The only thing God told them was, hold a sacred assembly and blow trumpets. Okay, so that's what they do. This is the second holiest day of the Jewish year, by the way. So they hold a sacred assembly and they blow trumpets. Now, 3 times in the Bible, God talks about blowing trumpets that have to do with the rapture. One is in 1 Thessalonians 4:16, this is Paul speaking. Paul talks about how the trumpet will blow and the dead in Christ will rise, and then those who are on the earth will rise and meet Christ in the air. The second one is one that we studied in our last class. It's in 1 Corinthians 15:52, where Paul tells us that the trumpet will blow and in a moment, in the flash, in an instant, in the flash of an eye or twinkling of an eye, we will all be changed and we will all get our new bodies. Jesus talks in Matthew 24 about how we cannot know the day or the hour of the rapture, and that is true. And in Revelation 4:1, we have what most people consider to be the rapture verse itself, where Jesus tells John, Jesus with a loud voice like a trumpet calls to John and says, "Come up here, come up here." So that is, most people view that as being the rapture verse in the Bible. Anyway, interestingly enough, the Jews celebrate this as a date called Rosh Hashanah. Rosh Hashanah means New Year. It's kind of weird because this is the beginning of the 7th month of the year. It's the first day today is Tishrei 1. It's the beginning of the 7th month of the Jewish year, but they call it New Year. It's kind of interesting. But their festival starts at sunset. And it's 3:54 here, but in Jerusalem it's 10:54 tonight that it starts. That is actually tomorrow in Israel, because the Jewish day doesn't start until sunset. So that is actually tomorrow in Israel. So if you were to ask a Jew, he would tell you that tomorrow is actually the Festival of Trumpets, but for us it is this afternoon. So just keep that in mind. I'm not saying Jesus is coming back today, but he might. And if he does, at least you will know, and you can perhaps tell your friends to get ready. Questions on that before we move on? I just wanted to cover that today. Every year, those of you that have been in my class know that every year I always point out the Festival of Trumpets, because you never know. In theory, Jesus could come back on any one of 365 different days of the year, but most experts will tell you that the likelihood that he would come back on the Festival of Trumpets is way higher than any of those other 364. Not 100% by any means, but higher. So who knows? Might be today. Okay, let's get into what we're talking about this week, which is we're going to look at the entry of Moses. Where we were last week, in order to understand what's going on during this complex period, as all these things are happening while the Jews are in Egypt and they're getting ready to come out of Egypt, we have to understand what's going on in Egypt itself during that period. And remember, before Amos, the pharaohs who were in power in Egypt were a group called the Hyksos, and they were actually Semites. And they took over, they defeated the Egyptians, and for about 100 years, the Semite pharaohs, the Hyksos pharaohs, ran the place. And we believe that the Pharaoh who invited Joseph in and who honored Joseph was one of those Hyksos pharaohs. He was a Semite. The Hyksos, by the way, came from pretty close to Israel. They came from Syria, and they were Semites. So we believe that the Hyksos were probably one of the pharaohs. And by the way, the Hyksos had about 20 pharaohs. They had about 100 years. We don't know which one it would have been, but it would have been one of those pharaohs. Eventually, the Hyksos got thrown out, and they got thrown out of Egypt by Pharaoh Ahmose. And Ahmose was a native Egyptian, which made him a Hamite. So we talked about him last week. When Ahmose came in, he realized that it took him a couple of years, but he realized that there were all these Jews, all these Semites who were up in Goshen, which was way north of where he was, and somehow their numbers were just growing incredibly. The numbers of them were growing. We know from the scriptures God was blessing them, but Amos would not have known that. So Amos decided to do something about it, and what he decided to do was to put them into slavery. And he figured, if I put them into slavery, the men will die. If the men die, then the women will eventually have to marry Egyptians, and next thing you know, the Jews will be gone, and everything's going to be great. So that was his thinking. It didn't work. God was not in that deal at all. God was in exactly the opposite. God was making the Jewish numbers grow during that period. So Moses failed at that, and then he tried, and then he began making the slavery more severe, figuring, if I make their labor so much harder, more of them will die, and then eventually they'll all die out. Well, that didn't work either. God just kept reproducing and kept the Jews reproducing and reproducing and reproducing, and kind of like a colony of rabbits or something. They would just creating new Jews all the time up there. So Moshe dies, and he gets replaced by his son, who is Amenhotep I. And we talked about Amenhotep a little bit last week. Amenhotep comes in and continues the process of trying to make the slavery ever more severe on the Jews, in the hopes that this population growth will finally stop and they'll die. But meanwhile, he wants to use them as labor, so he kind of likes the idea of having free labor too, to build his cities with. And that doesn't work either. And Amenhotep eventually dies as well. And at that point, by the way, Moshe also had, in addition to this son, Amenhotep, he also had a daughter who was the sister of Amenhotep. And when Amenhotep died, he did not have any children. By the way, that's surprisingly common back then. When Deb and I were over in Egypt a couple years ago, we went to the Mummy Museum over there, which has hundreds of mummies in it, of all these pharaohs and stuff. They basically have taken all the mummies from the tombs and put them in one museum in Cairo. And the thing that jumps out and grabs you about them is just how sickly these people look, number one, and number two, how much genetic dysfunction there is with them, because they were all into incestuous relationships. They believed that they had to keep the bloodline pure, and that meant brothers had to marry sisters, fathers had to marry daughters, all of those kinds of things. So pretty quickly, over a number of generations, they had a lot of what's the word I'm looking for? Genetic problems. I mean, people with feet that were at weird angles and extra toes, and just a lot of stuff going on over there. So the people, the leaders over there were pretty weak physically because of that. And almost every one of these mummies that you looked at has something weird about them that relates to the fact that they were so incestuous with how they did this. So at any rate, Amenhotep didn't have any children, presumably because of genetic issues. He did have a sister, however, because Moshe had a daughter. So when Amenhotep died, the sister had a husband who became Pharaoh after him. That was where the crown went to. The husband's name was Thutmose I. Thutmose I was the next Pharaoh to come into Egypt after Amenhotep died. Thutmose I, we believe, came into power in 1524 BC, 1526 BC. And apparently the first thing he did when he came into power was to decide to kill off Jewish babies. So he went, first of all, to the midwives. We talked about that last week, and tried to convince the midwives to kill Jewish babies. That didn't work. The midwives weren't about to. The midwives were Jews themselves, and they weren't about to kill off Jewish babies. So they just let them live. He wanted the male babies killed. He figured the female babies would be fine, but he wanted the male babies killed. And that didn't work. So then he went to a different approach, and that's where we're going to go today. We're going to start with verse 15. And this is now Pharaoh Thutmose I. We're going to go to verse 15. The king of Egypt, that would be Thutmose I, said to the Hebrew midwives, whose names were Shiphrah and Puah, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth on the delivery stool, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. So what he was telling these Jewish midwives is kill the babies right at birth. Just kill them right there. Now, I don't know, he probably had no idea how many Jewish babies were being born up there. I mean, there were thousands of Jewish babies being born every year. So two midwives are not going to be able to kill off all the Jewish men. And what's more, they weren't killing any of them. They actually decided that to do that would be sinful, majorly sinful, and God would not bless that. And they were good Jews, so they decided not to kill any of them. So guess what? Thutmose is looking around thinking, gee, these Jews are still growing in population, and there are babies wandering around. What's going on up there? So he calls the two people in, the two midwives. Oh, by the way, the midwives were Shiphrah and Puah. You will find a lot of literature out there that indicates that they might have been Miriam and Jochebed. Let me explain first of all who those were. Moses' parents were Amram, that's her father, and Jochebed was her mother. And they had 3 children. Miriam was the first, Aaron and Moses was the youngest. Miriam and Jochebed did a bunch of things together that we're going to talk about here as we get on into the day here today. But there are people who think that maybe the 2 midwives were Miriam and Jochebed. I kind of think that's probably not true. A lot of the timelines don't work out well to do that, but you may find publications out there that will indicate that those 2 might have been the 2 midwives. But basically, we don't know who Shiphrah and Puah were, is my position. I don't think we know that at all. So, verse 17, the midwives, however, feared God and did not do what the king of Egypt had told them to do. They let the boys live. Great. Way to go, ladies. Then the king of Egypt summoned the midwives and asked them, why have you done this? Why have you let the boys live? In other words, I told you to kill these boys. Why did you let them live? So he's beginning to realize almost immediately that this isn't really happening, that these Jewish boys are not being killed. Verse 18, the midwives answered Pharaoh, Hebrew women are not like Egyptian women. They are vigorous and give birth before midwives arrive. In other words, we can't get there in time. Huh? They must have super fast labors among British women, or among Egyptian women, right? Boom, quick labor done, midwife comes and the baby's already born. So it was obviously a lie. They told a lie. God let them tell a lie. He actually blessed them for doing this. But they lied to Pharaoh and told Pharaoh that the British, I don't know why I keep calling British, the Egyptian women are so vigorous that they just have...
Jewish women.
Yeah.
Israelite.
All right, I'm going to take a sip of coffee for a second.
We know what you mean.
Right.
Well,
So
I thought the interesting part of that about the midwives is verse 21, and so it was because the midwives feared God that he provided households for them.
I'm going to get to that in about 5 minutes. If
Okay.
you're just running a little bit ahead of me, I am going to
Sorry.
talk about that in a couple minutes. But
Okay.
let me finish up on this thought if I can.
Okay, you may.
So the midwives, who are Hebrews, are not about to kill Hebrew women, so they lie to Pharaoh and tell him that they give him a story. It's a story that's clearly not true. I don't know whether Pharaoh knew it or believed it or not, but he apparently let them live, so he must have maybe believed it. So verse 20. So God was kind to the midwives. I'm going to give you verse 21 as well. So God was kind to the midwives, and the people increased and became even more numerous. And because the midwives fear God, he gave them families of their own. So two thoughts in there. First of all, they got away with it, right? They went and lied to Pharaoh, and the result, more and more Jewish babies are being born, right? Jewish babies are coming into the world, they're being born. And God was so pleased with that he gave them the blessing of finding good families, good husbands and children, babies of their own. So that's part of the reason that I kind of think that this isn't Jochebed, because she already had her children at that time. So, at any rate, that's exactly your point, that God blessed them for doing this. It's not often we get blessed for lying in this world, but in this case, they got blessed for lying because they did it for a purpose that God approved of. So, now Pharaoh's sitting there, Pharaoh Thutmose is sitting there, and he's thinking, what is going on here? I can't figure out how I'm going to get this done. So, verse 22, then Pharaoh gave the order to all his people. This would be Egyptians now, his people, Egyptians. Every Hebrew boy that is born you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. So basically, we're not dealing with Jewish midwives anymore. We're now dealing with Egyptians. And the Egyptians are being told, throw the Hebrew boys when they're born into the Nile River. Raises a lot of interesting questions. Number one is, how would you convince people to do that? And there's lots been written on that. The basic thinking that I think makes the most sense is that the Nile River was considered a god by the Egyptian people. That was one of their gods. And perhaps Pharaoh came up with some thinking that said, or Pharaoh's religious people came up with some thinking that said, this God is displeased at the fact that all these Hebrews are being born, and he wants human sacrifice. He wants sacrifices to him, and the way we sacrifice is we toss the babies into the river. That would be kind of my thinking. That's not really my thinking. I picked that up from reading other people, but to me that seems most logical of how Pharaoh would have gotten away with being able to tell the people about this. But for whatever reason, he gave that order. Interestingly enough, he said, kill the boys, let the girls live. And in Egyptian society, men were so in control of everything that if he killed off the Jewish boys, his thinking was the Jewish women will just marry Egyptians, and that will solve the problem, because the babies will be Egyptians from there on in as they're born. So that was his thinking. So that's where we are. We now get to the point, and we are now in 1526 BC, where Jewish babies born are going to be thrown into the Nile River and killed. That's the point we're at. Enter the daughter of Pharaoh. Now, Pharaoh actually had two wives. His first wife, which would have been in what the Egyptians called it his royal wife, his first wife, did not have a son. Again, same problem we talked about, interbreeding, too much of it. But she gave him a daughter, and this daughter is called Hatshepsut. And Hatshepsut is probably the most famous person in all of Egyptian history, probably the most powerful Egyptian who's ever lived also. Hatshepsut was Pharaoh's daughter, Pharaoh Thutmose' daughter. We think this is probably the person that's being talked about here. Now, if you, back in the days, 70 years ago, when Cecil B. DeMille wrote the Ten Commandments, or put out the Ten Commandments movie, they weren't thinking that way. They were thinking in a whole different direction. But today, most of the thinking is that this was probably Pharaoh Thutmose I who was doing this, and his daughter is probably Hatshepsut. And we'll talk about why as we go on a little bit, because Hatshepsut has a long, long history that we're going to go through. She is involved in literally in 3 different generations of pharaohs in Egypt, and she was actually Pharaoh herself for a while as well. So we think that Hatshepsut was probably the person who was Pharaoh's daughter. So now we're going to go and talk about the birth of Moses. Now, this is now chapter 2, verse 1. Now a man of the tribe of Levi married a Levite woman. That is going to be these two here, Aaron and Jochebed. What we just found out from that verse is they are Levites. These are priests. These are Levites. They are descended from the tribe of Levi, which makes them priests. That doesn't mean a lot yet. It will, however, when Aaron becomes the first official priest at Mount Sinai. So they are from the tribe of Levi. They are priests. It also tells us Moses was a priest, by the way. So Moses was from the priestly line. He was not a priest per se, but he was from the priestly line. Verse 2, and she, that would be Jochebed, became pregnant and gave birth to a son. That is Moses. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. My translation says fine child. Some of the Jewish translations, and those of you who know me know I like to look at the Jewish translations that the rabbis translate, say godly child. I like that translation better than the word fine. Fine just means he looks good. I think what they really mean here is he was a godly child, which implies that Jochebed was getting some kind of revelation from God that this boy was special, that he was more than just, he was more than just some other boy who was born out there. He was more than just some accidental birth. And we're going to begin now to see all the parallels between Moses and Christ. Okay, Mary understood when she got pregnant with Jesus that this was going to be a very special boy. It looks from that word that Jochebed understood that from the get-go about Moses as well. And as we're going to go through this, we're going to see that she almost certainly did understand that there was something very special about Moses and that he needed to be protected from this edict that Thutmose had just put out that says he's got to be killed. By the way, there's your second parallel with Jesus, right? Remember what happened when Jesus was born. King Herod said, let's kill all the baby boys, because he was trying to make sure he killed off a potential threat to his own reign. Same thing here. Thutmose is saying, let's kill off all the baby boys right at the same time. So we're beginning to look at all the parallels, and there are a ton of them. As we go through this class, you'll see them. But they're all the parallels between the life of Moses and the life of Jesus. So you just keep an eye as you're going through this. Keep that in the back of your mind. There are a ton of parallels. So that's verse 2. He's a fine boy. She presumably had some kind of inspiration from God that let her know this, because we're about to see what he did, or what she did. But when she could hide him no longer, she got a papyrus basket for him and coated it with tar and pitch. Let me stop there. So when she could hide him no more, it says she hid him for 3 months, pardon me. Actually, I didn't read that part, did I? Let me go back and reread that. When she saw that he was a fine child, she hid him for 3 months. So she's trying to keep him out of being killed by Thutmose, who, by the way, is a relative of hers. She's trying to keep wrong person. Anyway, she's trying to keep, the real mother is trying to keep him from being killed by Thutmose. And so she is trying to figure out what to do. And she hides him for 3 months. But eventually a 3-month-old baby is getting loud, and he's crawling, or not crawling, but he's getting to the point where you can't exactly hide him too much longer. So she realizes she's got to do something. So what does she do? She gets a papyrus basket, which is like a straw basket, coats it with tar and pitch so that it's waterproof. Then she places the child in it and puts it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Now we're going to find out in a minute that she put it in a place where the daughter of Pharaoh could find it. Now, daughter of Pharaoh did not come up to Goshen, Egypt. Goshen, Egypt was 300 miles north of where Pharaoh was. In those days, we didn't actually have planes or airplanes or railways or cars or anything like that. A woman who just gave birth 3 months ago probably isn't likely to walk 300 miles across the desert. So the question, and Ben asked it last week, is how did she get there? How did she get, obviously the princess didn't come up to Goshen, Egypt, so how did the two of them connect here? And I thought about that, and I couldn't find anything where anybody else speculated about it, so I speculated myself. This is my guess. In those days, they did have a pretty busy river traffic going up and down the Nile River. There were boats going up and down the Nile River. They were sailing ships, so going down river was easy. Going up river was a lot harder. Those of you that have ever sailed know that to go up river, you've got to do this basically, whereas coming down river, you just come down. So it takes a lot longer. The only thing I can think of is that she got on a boat in Goshen and went upriver to where Pharaoh's daughter was. I don't know how else you can explain the connection between the two of them. Thank you for asking that question, Ben, because it made me think about how this happened. How did this happen? That's the only thing I can think of. And they definitely had active river traffic in those days, so presumably she got on a boat and went up there. That's my thought. At any rate, his sister stood at then she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. So she puts the child in the basket, puts Moses in the basket, and puts him in the reeds. If you know, reeds are like pieces of grass that grow up through the water, along the banks of the Nile. And then she walks away because she can't bear to watch what might happen to him. I mean, this is her baby, right? Then it says his sister, that would be Miriam, Moses' sister, his sister stood at a distance to see what would happen to him. So pretty much the mother says, I can't watch this, honey, you watch for me and make sure he's safe, right? So the daughter, Miriam, sister of Moses, watches what's happening. Okay, let's find out what does happen. Then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe. So she goes down to take a bath in the Nile, right?
So I have a question here. So there was a royal area where the royal family bathed in the river? Because
The
it
palace
says,
was right on the river.
okay, cause it says the daughter of Pharaoh came down to bathe at the river. So to me, that implies that there was a special place that the royal family bathed in the Nile River.
Very likely that's probably true. The Egyptian pharaohs built their palaces on the banks of the Nile River.
Okay.
And you have to go down in order to get to the river, or else you're gonna get flooded. So you have to go down to get to the river. So it makes sense that they would have had to go down. And it makes sense that the average general public kind of person isn't gonna go wandering into Pharaoh's
No.
palace.
No,
So yeah, it makes sense that it would be a special spot for her.
Probably
I
had
don't know.
privacy from the reeds and stuff.
yeah,
Whatever,
yeah.
I don't, to me that kind of makes sense. Any rate, then Pharaoh's daughter went down to the Nile to bathe, and her attendants were walking along the riverbank. So she goes down to the Nile, she's got a bunch of attendants around her, and she's bathing, and they're walking along the riverbank. She saw the basket among the reeds and sent her female slave to get it. So she sees this basket in the reeds and says, hey, attendant, go get that and bring it to me. Now obviously God's setting all this up. I hope we all realize this. Everything about
Yes.
these are not accidents, folks, all right?
No.
God is setting all this up because he wants to create this whole narrative of how the Jews came out of Israel, went to Egypt, grew their population, were saved out of Egypt from slavery and brought back to Israel. That's what this is all about. So God obviously is setting all this up. So these are not accidents that are happening. God is setting this up. Sent her female slave to get it. She opened it. The she, I would assume, is the princess, the Pharaoh's daughter. She opened it and saw the baby. So she opens this thing up. There's a baby in there. What's the baby doing? Crying, right? What the babies normally do when you put them in a river in a basket, right?
She didn't
Crying.
believe the baby didn't know that face.
Yeah, and she felt sorry for him. So God touched her heart at that point, right? I mean, those of you that are ladies understand that when you see a baby, something touches your heart. God touched their heart at that point, or God touched her heart at that point. She was crying. She felt sorry for him. And then she said, this is one of those Hebrew babies. So she knew immediately that it was a Hebrew baby. Why?
Circumcised.
Bingo, thank you. Yeah, if you watch the movie The Ten Commandments, they wrapped him in this Jewish cloth, and she found the Jewish cloth, but that's certainly, almost certainly not what it was. The Jewish baby was circumcised. Egyptians did not circumcise, so the baby was circumcised. Bingo, thank you. So she knew immediately that it was a Jewish baby. And he told everybody. I mean, she's not hiding this. If you watch the movie, this is all being hidden and hush hush. She's not hiding this at all. She's very upfront that this is a Jewish baby, and then she has found a Jewish baby. So, where am I? Oh, then, verse 7. Then his sister, that would be Miriam, asked Pharaoh's daughter, think about how bold this would be, for somebody who is a slave, the daughter of a slave, to go up to a princess of Egypt, walk up and ask a question, okay? Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? Wow. First of all, Pharaoh's daughter obviously couldn't nurse. She didn't have milk. So that meant she had to get what's called a wet nurse. And a wet nurse, they might have had some of those that might have been Egyptians, but she suggested getting a Hebrew wet nurse for her. Isn't that interesting? A Hebrew woman to be a wet nurse for her. You would think Pharaoh's daughter would have said, no thanks, we have plenty of those here in Egypt, but she didn't. Again, this is God, right? She didn't. She did not say that. What she said is, yes, go, she answered. The girl went and got the baby's mother. So, this girl happens to be the sister of Moses, right? Her mother's standing someplace off to the side, we don't know where. Pharaoh's daughter looks at the baby, falls in love with this baby, and Miriam says, shall I go get a Hebrew mother to nurse her? Pharaoh's daughter says yes. She goes and gets the real mother, her mother, the real mother, also Moses' mother, the real mother, to come and nurse the baby. Pretty cool, right? Amazing how God plans all this stuff. She just happened to be right there, and just happened to have the perfect milk for that baby. So she went and got the baby's mother. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, the her here would be the mother. It's not quite clear who the pronouns are all the time in the Bible. Pharaoh's daughter said to her, take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. So basically, obviously Moses took to the mother very easily, probably because he knew her for 3 months. So Moses took to being nursed by this mother very, very easily. So Pharaoh's daughter says, wow, okay, you're doing a good job. Why don't you take this baby and take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you. Now, a couple things. In those days, Egyptians nursed children until their 5th birthday. That was a special thing. On their 5th birthday, they stopped nursing. So if you can imagine a 5-year-old nursing, but at any rate, that was how they did it. They nursed him until their 5th birthday. So we're now 3 months old. So for the next 4 3/4 years, where is Moses? He's with his real mother. Okay, he's with his real mother for 4 3/4 years. Obviously, he's getting good milk and good nursing and all that, but he's probably getting a whole lot more than that, right? He's now finding out who he really is. Remember, Pharaoh's daughter knows he's a Hebrew. That's not a secret. He's finding out who he really is and what that means. In addition to that, he may very well have maintained some sort of relationship after that with her, so that as he grew, he might have had some sort of relationship with his real mother as well. So he's beginning from an early age to understand that he might be a little different than just the average Egyptian boy. Maybe. We don't know that for certain. It doesn't tell us that for certain. So the woman took the baby and nursed him until he's 5 years old. When the child grew older, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, that would be 5 years old, and he became her son. So at that point, at the age of 5, he brings her back to Pharaoh's daughter. And the interesting question would be, during that 4 3/4 year, did she just stay there in Luxor, in the palace, and nurse him there, so that both mothers were able to work with him? Or did she take him back up to Goshen and then come back down 4 3/4 years later? It's not clear. We don't know how that process went. But we know that she was certainly in his life, at least for that period, and Pharaoh's daughter might have been in that life, in his life, and might not have been in his life during that period. We don't really know that from what we read here in the scriptures. So when the child grew older, that would be 5 years old, she took him to Pharaoh's daughter, and he became her son. So at that point, she adopted him as her son. Now think about that for a minute. Oh, then it goes on and says, she named him Moses, saying, I drew him out of the water. Moses is not a Hebrew name. Moses is an Egyptian name, and Moses means out of the water. Moses also is the family name, Amose. So the family name is also Moses. So, and she's from Amose's family. She is descended from Amose's family. So it fit. And by the way, the reason Amose adopted that name for his family is that his troops came out of the Nile River to conquer the Hyksos and defeat the Hyksos. So again, God plans all this stuff, right? None of this is accidents. If anybody thinks things in this world are accidents, they're not. God plans things. God planned all this stuff. So Amose means out of the water. That's where he took the name from. And he certainly wasn't a Jew. And here we are later on. Moses gets the name out of the water because his mother, his adopted mother, took him out of the Nile River. Isn't that cool? So, yeah, speaking of interesting, just imagine the scene where she's now gotten her 5-year-old boy, she takes him in to meet her father. And at this point, everybody knows he's Hebrew.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody knows he's Hebrew.
Right.
Her father is Thutmose I, the guy who tried to kill him,
Right,
right?
right,
So she brings him into her father. I mean, she's taking him into the palace.
yeah.
She takes him in to meet her. This is her son. She's taking him into the palace. Takes him in to meet her father, the guy who tried to kill him. Imagine that, right? I'm sure he can do the math and say, let's see, he's 5 years old. What did I do 5 years ago? Oh, I was trying to kill all the Jewish boys. You know, imagine that scene. I've thought about that a number of times this week as I've gotten ready for this class. Imagine the scene of her walking up to her father, bringing this little 5-year-old boy with her, and saying, "Hey, Dad, this is my son. I've adopted him now. I've been, had him being nursed for 5 years, and I want you to treat him as my son." And imagine just imagine that scene. How cool that would have been. So we're up to now the point where our thing ends today, but I'm going to continue on and do something else with us for the rest of the time. I want to help you understand how significant it was that this is probably who his mother really was. We don't know absolutely for sure that Hatshepsut was his mother, but let me go through all this with you. It's going to get a little confusing, and the things look a little confusing. By the way, all of the orange stars means that they were Pharaoh. Okay, so these are people who actually were Pharaoh of Egypt. So Ahmose is the founder of the dynasty. He is the grandfather of Hatshepsut. Okay, Amenhotep is his son. Amenhotep can't have children because of all the inbreeding stuff. But Amenhotep had a sister who had a husband, so he becomes Pharaoh after Amenhotep dies. So Thutmose I is the next Pharaoh in line. Now, Thutmose I had a daughter who could not have a son, again, that whole inbreeding thing, but did have a daughter. Thutmose I had a first wife, who could not have a son, but did have a daughter, and that is Hatshepsut. So she is the daughter of Pharaoh. She is also the royal daughter. She is the firstborn. But being a daughter didn't cut it. He needed a son. So he gets a second wife. His second wife comes along, and she does have a son. And that son is Thutmose II. We haven't talked about him yet, but we're going to talk about him next week. Thutmose II is the second son. Is the son from the second wife. I'm getting confused myself. He is the son from the second wife, and he will eventually become Pharaoh. Now, Thutmose II needs a wife, right?
Yeah.
Who do you think he marries?
Half-sister.
Hatshepsut, his half-sister. So Thutmose I, again, all this inbreeding's going on over there. Thutmose II, when he becomes Pharaoh, which we'll talk about next week, marries Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut then is what's called his royal wife. She is his first wife. And she's also royal because she was descended from Pharaoh. So she has the if he ever takes another wife, and he will, if he ever takes another wife, he is the preferred wife. She is first in line as his royal wife. So she's daughter of Thutmose the first, royal wife of Thutmose II. Okay, same woman. Moses is her son, right? Now I'm going to continue on to something we'll get to later on next week. What happened after that? Eventually Thutmose II dies. Hatshepsut is still alive. Thutmose II has a son who is Thutmose III.
By her or by somebody else?
Not by Hatshepsut. Hatshepsut was not the mother of Thutmose III. It was a different wife. Hatshepsut could not give him a son. Again, all this inbreeding problem. Hatshepsut could not give him a son. I don't think Hatshepsut had any children with him. I'm not sure of that, but I don't think she had any children with him. Anyway, so he gets another wife, gets a son, Thutmose III. Now, when Thutmose II dies, Thutmose III is 1 year old, maybe 2, somewhere in the 1 to 2 range. He's a baby, right? Little thing. That means that he needs a regent until he's old enough to take the throne for himself. Under Egyptian tradition, the regent is the royal wife. So, not only is she the daughter of Thutmose I and the wife of Thutmose II, she's also the regent and stepmother of Thutmose III. Okay? Pretty important lady in Egyptian history, if you haven't figured that out by now. So, she begins to raise Thutmose III, begins to get him ready to be Pharaoh. Somewhere along the line, about 7 years into it, by the way, Thutmose III was, it was 21 years before Thutmose III actually came to the throne. The first 7 years of those, she treated him as she was the regent, he was the pharaoh. Eventually, she just kind of got rid of him as the pharaoh. She didn't kill him. She got rid of him as pharaoh, and she just became pharaoh herself. There were only, I think, 2 or 3 women ever, out of 200 pharaohs in Egyptian history, there were only 2 or 3 women who were ever pharaoh. This is one of them. So she became pharaoh herself, and she ruled for 14 years as pharaoh.
After the 21 years?
No.
You said
At
after
the end,
21 years, then he was.
he eventually came to the throne and ruled. But it was 21 years after Thutmose died, after Thutmose II died.
So then.
So for 7 years, she's in this thing of regent. After that, she just keeps him around. She doesn't kill him. She keeps him around. But she takes the throne herself and declares herself pharaoh.
Just for the next 14 years,
next
and then
14
after
years.
21 years, then he
After
becomes
21
pharaoh.
years, she dies, and Thutmose III becomes pharaoh. And as you're going to see, Thutmose III is pretty upset with her son, Moses. Okay? Thutmose III is almost certainly the pharaoh of the Exodus. Okay? When he finally takes the throne, first thing he does is deface all the monuments that had her picture on them. Steve, remember when we were over in Egypt, we saw all the stuff about Hatshepsut, how her son, Thutmose III, defaced all of her monuments. Everything that she had built, he defaced. He basically tried to take her out of existence as though she had never lived. So he was pretty upset with her for taking away his throne for 21 years, right? So guess how mad he was at her son, at Moses, right?
And him and Moses would be fairly close in age.
Moses would have been
Thutmose
fairly
the-
close in age with this guy here. These two were contemporaries.
No, because that's her husband. She married him, that's her husband, so then when she had the son,
Oh, right, I'm
Moses
sorry,
5,
you're
so
right,
he's
you're right.
really close in
Hatshepsut,
age
yeah.
to Thutmose
Right, I misunderstood what you're
III.
saying. I'm right. Hatshepsut would have been a contemporary of Thutmose
Right,
II.
but Moses
would have been a contemporary of Thutmose III. You're right. Thank you for pointing that out. I didn't think of that. So this woman is daughter of Pharaoh Thutmose I. She is royal wife of Pharaoh Thutmose II. She is regent and stepmother to Pharaoh Thutmose III, and eventually she becomes Pharaoh herself.
So
Special woman, right?
I've always had in my mind that there was tons of, like Pharaoh had many wives and had many children, and and Moses went to school with them or something. I mean, in my mind, I've always had that there was a whole bunch of royal kids, but that wasn't the case because of all
This
the
inbreeding was so bad.
I'm thinking like, the king and I, how many children he had from all his wives. I'm thinking it was something like that, but
Yeah, he probably
in this
wasn't
case-
marrying his sister and his mother and his daughter and all that stuff.
So-
The inbreeding was so bad that
So
there was a
there
real
just weren't
shortage
very
of
many
children in those things, and that's why all this stuff happened the way that it did. It all
Probably
goes
made
back
him
to the
mad, but
inbreeding.
even worse mad because the Israelites were having so many children.
Right? Yeah. Exactly. The Israelites are breeding like rabbits down there.
And they're like, can't
And-
even have a son.
And they're having all kinds of problems here. But just think of how important this woman was in Egyptian history, right?
Very.
Daughter of Thutmose I, royal wife of Thutmose II, regent and stepmother of Thutmose III, and eventually declares herself to be pharaoh and becomes a pharaoh, one of the very few ever pharaohs. By the way, one of the things we saw over there were pictures of her where she wore a beard. She wore a fake beard.
Yeah.
So,
Like a pharaoh.
yeah, so there must have been some people around who didn't like the idea of a woman being pharaoh. I can't imagine in this male-dominated world that anybody would have thought that way. But
How old was she when she died? Was she young or was she?
we don't have her exact age. We do know that she died in 1458 BC. Let me put that up here. So she died in 1458 BC.
So how many years did she reign then?
Oh, that we know. She
14.
reigned for 14 years. Basically, so she died in 1458.
Okay.
He died in 1479. Thutmose II died in 1479. By the way, Thutmose I, we think he died in 1494. We're not sure of that date. There's a lot of controversy on that date, but we think these dates are correct. So if she was, we think Thutmose I came to the throne in 1526. So if she was 20 years old in 1526, let's say old enough to want a son, maybe she was 15, I don't know. If she was 15 or 20, she would have been born in about 1540, early 1540s. She dies in 1458, she's probably 80, something like that, when she dies.
So why did they let her get away with this? Weren't there other committee people that would have said, no, he's next in line, not you? How could she like throw him under the bus, so to speak?
I'm not an expert on Egyptian history, although we learned a lot about Egyptian history when we were over there. Stephen and Deb and I and Stephen Kelly were over there a year ago on a mission trip. We learned a lot about it. We specifically learned a lot about her when we were over there. It was fascinating that God was getting me ready to teach this class. But
Well, if Thutmose III was only 1 or 2
yeah, he was 1 or 2 years old.
1 or 2 years old, then nobody would have probably fought her because she was legit leading the country, and maybe she was doing an okay job, and then she just
Yeah, at some point,
turn it over. It happened in the Jewish people too, where that, they had that evil queen, grandma or whatever that,
yeah,
killed off all the families so she could be queen. So they have a lot of power.
yeah. At any rate, I wanted to go through all that today because next week we're going to get into what was happening during this period with Moses. And before we can get into what was happening in that period with Moses, you need to understand what was going on in Egypt. And Hatshepsut had to be at the middle of a whole lot of what was going on with Moses at that point. So we're going to talk as we go through next week what happened with Moses when he was 40, what happened when he was 80, and just talk through all of that. So.
I never thought about it till you just were saying all this, but one thing, Miriam, you said she was pretty bold to just go up and say, but sometimes kids are fairly bold and they just go and talk to a stranger, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
And then you mentioned that the princess might have been young. I mean, so she could have been like a 15-year-old thinking, well, I want that kid or something, you know what I mean? Because they're selfish and they,
Well, if you think
so
of
who
it,
knows, she might have been pretty young.
children was so
Herself.
precious in Egypt because of all the inbreeding problem that, getting an opportunity to have a son, I mean, sons were way more valued than, no offense ladies, but sons were way more valued in that society.
Right.
Getting the opportunity to get a child and have a son, I mean, this is the only son she ever had, was Moses. Yeah.
Would Moses' mother never have told him that she was his real mother?
I can't imagine that he didn't know that. I mean, she nursed him until he was 5.
Right, that's why I'm asking.
So he had to know this was his real mother. Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
In fact, there's a number of places when it makes it clear that Moses knew he was. Next week we're going to open up with a passage where Moses knows that he's a Jew.
Yeah.
So we're going to open up next week with that passage. That's the next verse we're going to come to. I've kept you a minute or two over here. Anything else before we? Okay.